The thief entered the house and did not come out alive. Michael intended to murder Mrs. James and loot everything she owned, including her home. She'll be dead soon, and I'll have all the money this old hag has, he thought, planning the robbery. However, his nefarious plans were dashed when he caught sight of an old photograph in her home. Mrs. James was walking down the village street with a bag of rolls in her hand. It was getting dark, and the elderly lady was lost in her thoughts of her late son Nick, who had strolled with her on the streets several times as a child. Mrs. James' thoughts of him never left her mind, and with her advanced age, they'd only grown stronger. She'd kept blabbering as she walked down the street or walked down the farm as if she was talking to someone. When the neighbors asked why she kept murmuring all the time, she said she was talking to her son in heaven, and he was telling her stories about the place. Some neighbors, concerned about her condition, advised her to see a doctor, while others made fun of her and avoided her altogether. Mrs. James was on her way home one day when she heard a voice from behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am. My name's Michael. I need your help." Since it was dark and her eyes had partially stopped supporting her due to her age, Mrs. James couldn't see who was calling. "Did you bring a friend with you today, Nick? But why are you quiet? Why is it that your friend is doing the talking?" she asked, believing that her son had brought someone with him. However, as the unfriendly acquaintance took a step forward, his face shone brightly in the streetlight, and Mrs. James took a step back. He was a tall man in his 40s, unshaven and dressed shabbily. Mrs. James was frightened by his appearance. "Who are you and why are you following me?" "I'm just a handyman, ma'am," Michael replied. "I see you have a broken fence in your garden. May I repair it for you? I'm in desperate need of money because I haven't eaten in days." Mrs. James looked around. Not a single soul appeared in sight. Plus, it was getting dark and he seemed suspicious. "Should I let him in? He doesn't look right to me." "No, there's no need for that," she replied, deciding not to let him in. "I'll get it repaired later because I'm busy." "Please, ma'am, I'm making a request. I'm starving and desperate for money. I'm not asking for anything for free," Michael pleaded on his knees. "I'm willing to work in exchange, please." With Michael pleading like that, Mrs. James felt terrible for the man's situation and decided to let him in, thinking he really needed the money. "Fine, but I'm not going to pay you anything more than $20 for it. Is that all right with you?" she asked him. "Indeed, ma'am. It's more than enough for a homeless man like me," Michael responded. But deep down, he was prepared with his nefarious scheme. He'd been watching the neighborhood for a while, and he knew Mrs. James was living alone. First, he planned to threaten her to write a note stating she wanted the property transferred to him after her death. Then he intended to kill her and make it appear as if she'd committed suicide. In any case, no one would bother because everyone in the colony knew she wasn't medically fit and frequently hallucinated. Then he'd show up as her late son's friend, organize the funeral, shed a few tears, and gradually move into the house. Michael took everything he needed and pretended to build the fence, ready to carry out his plan. When he noticed Mrs. James going inside, he silently followed her. He was holding a knife, prepared to threaten the old lady with it, but Mrs. James went inside the bedroom and shut the door just as he was about to do so. He waited outside the door for a few minutes, but she didn't come out. He decided not to waste any more time and enter her room through the window. The man dashed outside and broke open the window with a screwdriver. Then he went inside, slowly replacing the glass. But Mrs. James wasn't there. Suddenly, he heard the clinking of utensils. He peeked out the bedroom and saw Mrs. James setting the table with muffins and sandwiches and placing a kettle on the stove. He quickly repaired the window and fled the bedroom, opting to enter through the back door that led into the kitchen. However, as he entered the kitchen, he was stopped in his tracks by a framed photo on the dining room table. It was him and his comrade Nick James in the photograph. "Oh, here you are," Mrs. James said, turning around after setting 2 teacups on the table. "I was planning on calling you. Are you finished putting up the fence? Have something. You kept telling me you were hungry." "Where'd you get that, ma'am?" Michael said, hiding the knife behind him, his gaze fixed on the photo. "Do you know them?" "Oh, you're talking about this photo? That's my son Nick and his comrade Paul. Come, sit, I'll tell you everything." Michael's eyes welled up and his past flashed before his eyes as Mrs. James narrated the entire incident that had occurred 20 years ago. It turned out that Nick and Paul, whose real name was Michael, were comrades in the army. They were on their way back to their base when their entire group came under mortar fire. Nick attempted to save Paul's life and was killed in the process. Paul left the army without a trace, haunted by the guilt that his comrade had died saving him. He blamed himself for everything, drank excessively, and became involved in criminal activities when his money ran out. He'd come to believe that good things only bring pain and suffering, much like how Nick ended up dead when all he was trying to do was save a comrade's life. However, sitting in Nick's mother's kitchen, being served food by the poor woman who was telling him about her late son, he realized he was wrong. "Paul, what were you thinking? Have you gone insane? You were about to murder Nick's mother." From that day on, it seemed like Michael was a completely different person. He not only gave up on the wrongdoings, but also confessed to his crimes and turned himself in. When he was released from prison after doing a sentence, he began paying frequent visits to Mrs. James. He took care of her, spent time with her, and made sure she was never alone. When Mrs. James died at the age of 98, he received a call from her lawyer informing him that she had left a note as well as property and assets. Michael couldn't stop crying when he arrived at the lawyer's office and received the letter. Mrs. James had written that she always knew he was Nick's friend and comrade. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize you?" the note said. "Yes, at first I didn't, but when I looked at you closely, I knew it was you. Paul, I knew you were going to kill me that day. I noticed you were following me with a knife, but look at you. You're still the sweet young man Nick told me about. You kept telling me that a friend died because of your actions. If I'm not mistaken, you were talking about Nick. I recall you'd gone missing from the army and everyone was looking for you. I wanted to meet you back then, but no one knew where you went. Stop blaming yourself for what happened, Paul. Nick didn't die because of you. If you're reading this, promise me you'll never turn to a life of crime. Also, thank you for taking such good care of me. I'm glad we finally met. At least I didn't miss my son in my final days. I hope you live happily and never miss out on anything. With love, Mrs. Claire James." What can we learn from this story? Goodness triumphs over evil. Mrs. James was well aware that Michael was out to kill her, but she took a chance and tried to deal with him nicely, which changed him. Don't blame yourself for everything. It was an accident that Nick died while saving Michael. He shouldn't have blamed himself for what happened. Another shocking lesson. A shocking video of theft has surfaced on social media these days, where he entered the house to steal like Spider-Man by hanging on the electric wires and stole valuables and got out of his feet. On the internet, you've seen many things related to thief viral videos you must have seen where thieves execute their work so intelligently, seeing whose exploits the superheroes of the film are stunned, because where the superheroes in the film climb up the big skyscrapers in the blink of an eye to save someone's life, the thief of Delhi was also seen climbing the skyscraper like Spider-Man. After seeing this, even Spider-Man will be stunned for a moment. The matter is being told of Karaji Khas of East Delhi, where the thief entered the house like Spider-Man and left after cleaning his hands on the valuables. Stands near a parked car under the house, looks for a way to enter the house, and then brainstorms the room through the balcony of the house with the help of hanging electric wire and hands over the valuables in the house. Clearly, he leaves from there, and the whole incident was recorded in the CCTV camera installed nearby. The police of the area had registered a case against the thief. According to the police, the name of the person in whose house the thief had entered is Surenda Singh. Surenda, while registered an FIR, told the police that the thief had stolen a gold chain, ring, a mobile phone from his house, and after stealing all these valuables, he fled through the gate. As soon as the news agency ANI shared the video on Twitter, after which users started giving their feedback on this. What happened next was shocking. An opportunistic thief has been caught on CCTV footage inside a pensioner's home stealing money from his wallet, having brazenly walked straight into the house one afternoon. The anonymous man entered the Leeds home of 88-year-old Dennis Birch, who was wheelchair-bound, at around 4 p.m. on the 10th of July. Dennis had left his door open due to the hot summer weather that day when the intruder came past and spotted his easy opportunity. Police have confirmed that they're looking into what happened to poor Dennis and that inquiries are ongoing. Dennis's son, Paul Daly, has since released the CCTV footage from the incident at his father's home. Explaining how Dennis had the door open due to how hot it was, Paul said his dad had to watch as the intruder walked in and went upstairs. Paul told Newsflare, "I was in total shock when I watched the footage. The guy who does it, he's a professional. The way he conceals his actions, the guy's a pro, and we'd definitely like him caught and prosecuted." He continued, "It's affected me because I worry about him, and now I worry about him even more because if this guy's not caught, he'll be back or passing on his details to his other friends because my dad's in a wheelchair and can't defend himself." The thief apparently spoke in a different manner to Dennis, while supposedly scoping his nearby surroundings for valuables. In a statement supplied to the Yorkshire Evening Post, local police confirmed they're investigating the burglary. A spokeswoman said, "Police are investigating a report of a residential burglary on Ashton Place, Hare Hills. Inquiries are ongoing."